Hey guys, it's Miss Humblebaugh here. I hope that you've been enjoying your break for spring break this week, and I cannot wait to start meeting with you guys again next week when we go back to our virtual learning. I know I haven't uploaded a video in a long time, so today I'm going to read 5 chapters of Wayside School for us. And you know what? I'm not going to ask any questions this time. I want you guys to finish enjoying your spring break, so I'm just going to read the 5 chapters, okay? Starting on Chapter 5. Chapter 5, Todd. All of the children in Mrs. Jewell's class except Todd were talking and carrying on. Todd was thinking. Todd always thought before he spoke. When he got an idea, his eyes lit up. Todd finished thinking and began to speak. But before he said 2 words, Mrs. Jewell called him. "Todd," she said, "you know better than to talk in class. You must learn to work quietly like the other children." She wrote his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Todd looked around in amazement. All of the other children who had been talking and screaming and fighting only seconds earlier were quietly working in their workbooks. Todd scratched his head. A child was given 3 chances in Mrs. Jewell's class. The first time he did something wrong, Mrs. Jewell wrote his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. The second time he did something wrong, she put a check next to his name. And the third time he did something wrong, she circled his name. Todd reached into his desk and pulled out his workbook. He had only just started on it when he felt someone tap him on the shoulder. It was Joy. "What page are you on?" Joy asked. "Page 4, Todd whispered. "I'm on page 11, said Joy. Todd didn't say anything. He didn't want to get into trouble. He just went back to work. 5 minutes later, Joy tapped him again. Todd ignored her. So Joy poked him in the back with her pencil. Todd pretended he didn't notice. Joy got up from her seat and sharpened her pencil. She came back and poked it in Todd's back. "What page are you on?" she asked. "Page 5, Todd answered. "Boy, are you dumb," said Joy. "I'm on page 29. "It isn't a race," Todd whispered. 5 minutes later, Joy pulled Todd's hair and didn't let go until he turned around. "What page are you on?" she demanded. "Page 6, Todd answered as quietly as he could. "I'm on page 200, Joy shouted. Todd was very angry. "Will you please let me do my work and stop bothering me?" Mrs. Jewell heard him. "Todd, what did I say about talking in class?" Todd scratched his head. Mrs. Jewell put a check next to Todd's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Todd really tried to be good. He knew that if he talked one more time, Mrs. Jewell would circle his name. Then he'd have to go home early at 12 o'clock on the kindergarten bus, just as he had the day before and the day before that. In fact, there hadn't been a day since Mrs. Jewell took over the class that she didn't send Todd home early. She said she did it for his own good. The other children went home at 2 o'clock. Todd wasn't really bad. He just always got caught. He really wanted to stay past 12 o'clock. He wanted to find out what the class did from 12 to 2. But it didn't look as though this was going to be his day. It was only 10:30, and he already had 2 strikes against him. He sealed his lips and went back to work. There was a knock on the door. Mrs. Jewell opened it. 2 men stepped in wearing masks and holding guns. "Give us all your money," they demanded. "All I have is a nickel," said Mrs. Jewell. "I have a dime," said Mauricia. "I have 13 cents, said Leslie. "I have 4 cents, said Damien. "What kind of bank is this?" asked one of the robbers. "It's not a bank, it's a school," said Todd. "Can't you read?" "No," said the robbers. "Neither can I," said Todd. "Do you mean we walked all the way up 30 flights of stairs for nothing?" asked the robber. "Don't you have anything valuable?" Todd's eyes lit up. "We sure do," he said. "We have knowledge." He grabbed Joy's workbook and gave it to the robbers. "Knowledge is much more valuable than money." "Thanks, kids," said one of the robbers. "Maybe I'll give up being a criminal and become a scientist," said the other. They left the room without hurting anybody. "Now I don't have a workbook," complained Joy. Mrs. Jewell gave her a new one. Joy had to start all the way back at the beginning. "Hey, Joy, what page are you on?" asked Todd. "Page 1, Joy sighed. "I'm on page 8, laughed Todd triumphantly. Mrs. Jules heard him. She circled his name. Todd had 3 strikes against him. At 12 o'clock, he left the room to go home early on the kindergarten bus. But this time when he left, he was like a star baseball player leaving the field. All the children stood up, clapped their hands, and whistled. Todd scratched his head. Man, Todd is a hoot, guys. I can't wait to learn more about him later on in the book. Right now, we're going to learn about BB. Chapter 6, BB. BB was a girl with short brown hair, a little BB nose, totally tiny toes, and big brown eyes. Her full name was BB Gunn. She was the fastest draw in Mrs. Jules' class. She could draw a cat in less than 45 seconds, a dog in less than 30, and a flower in less than 8 seconds. But of course, BB never drew just one dog or one cat or one flower. Art was from 12:30 to 1:30. Why, in that time, she could draw 50 cats, 100 flowers, 20 dogs, and several eggs or watermelons. It took her the same amount of time to draw a watermelon as an egg. Calvin sat next to BB. He didn't think he was very good at art. Why, it took him the whole period just to draw one airplane. So instead, he just helped BB. He was BB's assistant. As soon as BB would finish one masterpiece, Calvin would take it from her and set down a clean sheet of paper. Whenever her crayon ran low, Calvin was ready with a new crayon. That way, BB didn't have to waste any time. And in return, BB would draw 5 or 6 airplanes for Calvin. It was 12:30, time for art. BB was ready. On her desk was a sheet of yellow construction paper. In her hand was a green crayon. Calvin was ready. He held a stack of paper and a box of crayons. "Ready, BB?" said Calvin. "Ready, Calvin," said BB. "Okay," said Mrs. Jules. "Time for art." She had hardly finished her sentence when BB had already drawn a picture of a leaf. Calvin took it from her and put another piece of paper down. "Red," called BB. Calvin handed BB a red crayon. "Blue," called BB. He gave her a blue crayon. They were quite a pair. Their teamwork was remarkable. BB drew pictures as fast as Calvin could pick up the old paper and set down the new. A fish, an apple, 3 cherries, bing, bing, bing. At 1:30, Mrs. Jules announced, "Okay, class, art is over." BB dropped her crayon and fell over on her desk. Calvin sighed and leaned back in his chair. He could hardly move. They had broken their old record. BB had drawn 378 pictures. They lay in a pile on Calvin's desk. Mrs. Jules walked by. "Calvin, did you draw all these pictures?" Calvin laughed. "No, I can't draw." BB drew them all. "Well then, what did you draw?" asked Mrs. Jules. "I didn't draw anything," said Calvin. "Why not? Don't you like art?" asked Mrs. Jules. "I love art," said Calvin. "That's why I didn't draw anything." Mrs. Jules did not understand. "It would have taken me the whole period just to draw one picture," said Calvin, "and BB would only have been able to draw 100 pictures. But with the 2 of us working together, she was able to draw 378 pictures. That's a lot more art." BB and Calvin shook hands. "No," said Mrs. Jules, "that isn't how you measure art. It isn't how many pictures you have, but how good the pictures are. Why, a person could spend his whole life just drawing one picture of a cat. In that time, I'm sure BB could draw 1,000,000 cats." 2,000,000, said BB. Mrs. Jules continued, "But if that one picture is better than each of BB's 2,000,000, then that person has produced more art than BB." BB looked as if she was going to cry. She picked up all the pictures from Calvin's desk and threw them in the garbage. Then she ran from the room. "I thought her pictures were good," said Calvin. He reached into the garbage pail and took out a crumpled up picture of an airplane. BB walked outside into the playground. Louis, the art teacher, spotted her. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I'm going home to draw a picture of a cat," said BB. "Will you bring it to school and show it to me tomorrow?" Louis asked. "Tomorrow?" laughed BB. "By tomorrow I doubt I'll even be finished with one whisker." Phoebe's a little overdramatic, but hopefully she's learned a lesson. Maybe Calvin has too, because we're about to learn about Calvin. Chapter 7, Calvin. Calvin had a big round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, I want you to take this note to Miss Zarvies for me. Miss Zarvies? Asked Calvin. Yes, Miss Zarvies, said Mrs. Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we have already established that fact, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story, Calvin repeated. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jules. Now take it to her before I lose my patience. But Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin. Slowly, he walked out the door. Laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Mrs. Zarvies, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But he also forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There was also no Mrs. Zarvies. Miss Zarvies taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Mrs. Zarvies. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin the note. Boy, this is just great, thought Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist and who teaches on a story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, and back up again to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There was never a 19th story, and there will never be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Miss Zarvies' mailbox, but there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't have a note. He looked out the window and saw Louis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Louis will know what to do, he thought. Calvin went outside. Hey, Louis, Calvin called. Hi, Calvin, said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Louis asked. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarvies up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here? Louis asked. There is no 19th story, said Calvin. Then where's Miss Zarvies? Asked Louis. There is no Miss Zarvies, said Calvin. What are you going to do with the note? Asked Louis. There is no note, said Calvin. I understand, said Louis. That's good, said Calvin, because I sure don't. It's very simple, said Louis. You are not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Mrs. Jules that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Louis. The truth is always the best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. Thank you very much, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, but Mrs. Jules interrupted him. That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you. Yes, but you see, said Calvin, you delivered the note to Miss Zarvies on the 19th story, asked Jason. How did you do it? What do you mean, how did he do it? Asked Mrs. Jules. He gave Miss Zarvies the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. The note was very important, said Mrs. Jules. I told Miss Zarvies not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin. She won't. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin. But really, it was nothing. Guys, I want to learn more about what happened with no 19th story and no note and who is Miss Zarvies. Do you guys think she's actually real? I told you I wasn't going to ask you questions, but this chapter, it tempted me. I'm sorry. All right, chapter 8. We're going to learn about Myron. Myron had big ears. He was elected class president. The children in Mrs. Jewls' class expected him to be a good president. Other presidents were good speakers. Myron was even better. He was a good listener, but he had a problem. He didn't know what a class president was supposed to do. So he asked, "What am I supposed to do?" "It's a difficult job," said Mrs. Jewls, "but you can do it. You must turn the lights on every morning and turn them off at the end of the day." "What?" asked Myron. "As a class president, you must learn to listen," said Mrs. Jewls. "I'll repeat myself only one more time. You must turn the lights on every morning." "I heard you the first time," said Myron. "It just doesn't sound like much of a job." "It certainly is," said Mrs. Jewls. "Without light, I can't teach, and the children can't learn. Only you can give us that light. I think it is a very important job." "I guess so," said Myron. He wasn't convinced. "Here, let me show you how to work a light switch," said Mrs. Jewls. "I already know how," said Myron. "I've been turning lights on and off all my life." "Very good," said Mrs. Jewls. "You'll make a fine president." Myron wanted to be the best president ever, but it was such an easy job, he thought, that anybody could do it. When school let out that day, Myron stayed behind. He turned out the lights by flicking the switch down. "Excellent," said Mrs. Jewls. On his way home, Myron heard a horrible noise. First, there was loud screeching, then a sharp squeal, a roaring engine, and then the very faint sound of a girl crying. Myron ran to see what had happened. Dana was bent over in the middle of the road. "What's the matter?" asked Myron. "My dog, Pugsy, was hit by a car," Dana cried. "Who did it?" asked Myron. "I don't know," Dana sobbed. "They sped away." "Well, that's not important," said Myron. "We've got to try to save Pugsy." Pugsy lay unconscious in the street. Myron carefully picked her up. He carried her 2 miles to the vet. Dana cried at his side. "Don't worry, Dana," said Myron. "She'll be all right." But he wasn't really so sure. He gave Pugsy to the vet, walked Dana home, then walked home himself. Dana was so upset that she forgot to thank him. Myron didn't mind. He thought that was what being class president was all about. The next morning, before he went to school, Myron went to Dana's house. Pugsy was there. She seemed all right. Dana petted her. Pugsy licked her face. "See, Myron? She's all right," said Dana. "The vet said that you brought her just in time." "Hi, Pugsy," said Myron. He petted her. Pugsy bit his hand. "I guess she doesn't know you," said Dana. "She was unconscious yesterday when you saved her life." Dana's mother put some medicine and a Band-Aid on Myron's hand. Then she drove the children to school. They were late. They ran up the stairs to Mrs. Jewls' class. The room was completely dark. "It's about time you got here, Myron," said Mrs. Jewls. "We have no lights." "Why didn't someone else just turn them on?" asked Myron. "Because you're class president," said Mrs. Jewls. "Show Stephen how to work the lights. From now on, he will be class president." Myron showed Stephen how to turn on the lights. He flicked the switch up. At the end of the day, Myron showed Stephen how to turn the lights off. He flicked the switch down. After a week, Stephen finally caught on. He made a good president. The lights were on every morning. Myron, who was president for only a day, was the best president in the history of Wayside School. It was just that nobody knew it. Poor Myron. Well, guess what? Chapter 9, time to learn about Maricia. Maricia liked ice cream. She was sweet and pretty and could beat up any boy in Mrs. Jewls' class. Everybody liked Maricia, except Kathy. But then she didn't like anybody. Maricia only liked ice cream. Every day, Maricia brought an ice cream cone to school and kept it in her desk until lunchtime. At first, she brought chocolate ice cream every day, but she soon tired of chocolate ice cream, so she started bringing vanilla, but she got tired of vanilla too. Then she got tired of strawberry, fudge ripple, butter pecan, pistachio, and burgundy cherry, in that order. And then a terrible thing happened. Mauricia got tired of ice cream. By that time, her desk was a mess and everything in it was sticky. Everybody liked Mauricia, but Mauricia didn't like anything. Mrs. Jules hated to see Mauricia unhappy. "I don't understand it, Mrs. Jules," cried Mauricia. "There just aren't any good flavors anymore." So Mrs. Jules worked all night. The next day, she brought in a new flavor of ice cream for Mauricia. It was Mauricia flavored ice cream. "Everybody will like it," thought Mrs. Jules, because everybody likes Mauricia. "Here you are, Mauricia," said Mrs. Jules. "Mauricia flavored ice cream." Everybody gathered around as Mauricia tasted it. They hoped she'd like it. Mauricia took a lick. "Well?" said Mrs. Jules. Mauricia took another lick. "Well?" asked the class. "This ice cream has no taste," said Mauricia. "It doesn't taste bad, but it doesn't taste good. It doesn't taste like anything at all." Mrs. Jules was heartbroken. "Here, let me try it," said Todd. He tasted it. "You're crazy, Mauricia," he said. "This is the best tasting ice cream I've ever eaten. Try some, Dee Dee." It's delicious," said Dee Dee. "It's so sweet and creamy." She passed it around the room. "Oh, it is so good," said Leslie. "I think it tastes terrible," said Kathy. "I don't understand it," said Mauricia. "I don't taste a thing." Mrs. Jules slapped herself in the face. "Oh, I've made a big mistake, Mauricia. Of course you can't taste anything. It's Mauricia flavored ice cream. It's the same taste you always taste when you're not tasting anything at all." So the next day, Mrs. Jules brought in Joe flavored ice cream. Mauricia liked it. So did everybody else. Joe thought it had no taste. Everybody liked Mauricia. Mauricia only liked Joe. The following day, Mrs. Jules brought in Ron flavored ice cream. Ron thought it had no taste, but everybody else loved it. Everybody liked Mauricia. Mauricia only liked Joe and Ron. By the end of the month, Mrs. Jules had brought in 27 new flavors of ice cream, one for each member of the class. Everybody liked Mauricia, and Mauricia liked everybody. They all tasted so good. All except Kathy, that is. Kathy flavored ice cream tasted a little bit like old bologna. Everyone still agreed that Mauricia flavored ice cream was the best, except Mauricia. She liked Todd ice cream the best. This turned out to be a problem. Every once in a while, Mauricia would try to take a bite out of Todd's arm in order to get that very special flavor. So we read chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 9. Alright, I am going to stop here at chapter 10 for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the 5 chapters, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your spring break. I can't wait to talk with you on Thursday, and on Monday I will upload chapters 10 and 11. Love you guys. Mwah.